So anyway, yeah, cut straight to the chase in this video rather than messing around. I want to say something about just memory. So in the analogies with computers or whatever, we've got computer memory, and that's the ability to store stuff, to store information. And to store is where we store grains in wheat, which is all the beginning of religion really, as far as I can see, when we start settling down and farming the land and cultivating, which means growing crops, which means producing a harvest, which means producing more than what we need, which means having to store some through the winter months to keep us through the lean period in the January, February, March, where there's not much stuff that you can eat growing around. But of course, if you're just eating a meat diet, then that isn't really much of a problem because you're just going out and hunting, and even in the winter it's easy enough to hunt. La-di-da-di-da. But store and stories being the same thing, and I've already spoken about how stories are constructed, just like buildings are constructed. So we're living inside in constructions, and we've got our heads around that we live inside in houses, and houses are actually artificial habitats in an artificial environment. So we are living in an environmentally artificial atmosphere kind of thing. So all that to say that we can live inside in stories, and that stories can be stored in our memory. And that memory is that you have to have a prefrontal cortex in your temples. It's back to the religious storehouses, that it's the religions are able to predict the seasons, which is what's able to grow the crops, which is what's able to store the stories in the grain houses, which is like a grain of truth kind of thing, language-wise. But yes, so we can live inside in stories. We can live inside in multiple stories. We can live in apartments inside in shared buildings and yet never really see each other. All that kind of stuff. So this is all hive mind kind of stuff in a way. But things we overlook about memory because we take it all for granted, because of course we don't have to learn how to remember, we just remember. We don't have to learn where we store memories, we just have access to memories. We don't know how it is that we have our memory jogged, or what was the word? These days it's prompted. You are prompted for your memory to be drawn from your database of graphics, because they are epigraphs. We store our memories as images to some degree. We store our memories as filed away in our memories. So the analogies are all there. I'm not really making it up. And there is another concept around the idea that we tend to have beliefs that our brain works in the same way as the technology that we tend to use these days. So I think a word like cognition is actually to do with mechanical devices. So the ignition of the cogs of the vehicle kind of thing is how we're able to make forward motion in our vehicles. And so we have words like cognition and recognition. And there's also the cogs in the clockwork. So for the longest time, it was a clock was the thing that we had. That was the technology that we had access to, that had the idea of keeping time, and that something is watching out over us, and that there's a universal time, and that there's a coordination of regional times into what became a universal time with Greenwich Mean Greenwich Mean Time kind of thing. All of which you should really look up on the internet. The AI mode is good enough actually to get the story of and the links for how it was decided that Greenwich Mean Time was going to be based in London, not the other places where it could have been based, and how it was the invention of trains that really made it necessary for us to have a shared universal time instead of different regional times based on the motion of the sun kind of thing. But the thing I actually want to say about memory is that we don't have any. We don't have any memory of when we were conceived. I don't have any memory of when I was born. We have very little memory of when we were children. So when do we start to have any accurate memory? How is memory stored in our memory? And what happens with short-term memory and how does it become filed into long-term memory, and what happens with dementia, which is basically where the short-term memory and the long-term memory, the short-term memory doesn't really function properly anymore, and being able to retrieve information from the short-term memory of like what was happening a minute ago in terms of where's my attention, what's my intention, what was it I was doing, what was I talking about, and it tends to go further and further and further into just having long-term memories, which is really being in a virtual world of you're living in your memories of things that were going on that you remembered when you were a kid, but you haven't remembered for like 50, 60, 70 years. This was going on with my mum when she was in the last 5 years of her life, especially, I suppose, spending more and more of her time remembering, reminiscing about long ago times. So we remember back to our childhood more and more and more as we get closer and closer to death. So it's as if as the circle becomes a full circle, the end of life starts to join together with the start of life. But the memory hole, we have no whole memory, we have no whole truth, we don't know what the whole truth, there's a hole in the hole kind of thing. There's a W, as in there's two U's in the I. We speak sentences, and yet we say we are sentient beings. And a sentient being is just a sentence with an I in the middle. Sentient. Kind of thing. So who put the I in the W? Who put the I in the hole? There is no I in we. All these little phrases are quite curious. But the whole thing about it is that we actually make up our memories. We don't have accurate memories. We don't recall our memory very well. But we call things to mind, which again, to invoke, to summon the prefrontal cortex. Cortex. Another thing that I want to record here is that like the written word becoming the Bible and all that thing, the stories getting compiled and stored in what becomes books. But that all happened in Alexandria. And I was just like picking whelks the other day, and it occurred to me yesterday, Alexandria. Who was this Alexandria? You know, he's supposed to have died at the age of 33. He was supposed to have conquered nearly the whole world by the age of 33. It's fucking ridiculous condensation of stories, but that's what the stories are, is a condensation of things that happened over many generations being personified as one person. So why is his name Alexandria? Because the thing about Alexandria is lex, as in lexicon, as in lex being a thing to do with writing. So Alexandria is where all the writing happened, and lexicography is the art of writing to some degree, or writing things down or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, stuff. So consider that our whole society is based on memory, and yet we don't actually have any accurate memory whatsoever. And our whole society is based on history, and history is high stories, and history is actually a view from a high hill, and a high hill is a knoll, and looking out over the edge of a high hill is looking out over the knoll edge, and knoll edge is what we call knowledge, and knowledge is based from the past in the present projected onto the future. None of it's really real. It's all a virtual world that we are projecting in our mind, which is now being mirrored by a virtual world, which is made physical by these data centers and all the communication systems that go with it. And yeah, another thing to say about all of that is there is an equivalence. You see, the human brain uses the most of the energy in the human body. When the brain really needs to figure out survival stuff or whatever, it can use up to like 20-25% of all the energy in the body is all sucked up to the brain. So that's quite equivalent to what's going on with these data centers. The data centers, in order to figure out how we're going to like solve all the world's problems or whatever, so that we can survive as a species using the AI. I'm not saying that that's what's really going on, but it's a bit like that. But it mirrors what goes on in our own personal bodies. And so the brain is actually using most of the resources. And the biggest thing that the brain tries to figure out in order to survive is whether you can believe the things that you believe, whether you can trust other people. So the biggest amount of processing that the brain does in order to survive is figuring out whether you can trust the people who you trust and whether you can believe the things that you believe. And ultimately, it's whether you can believe your own memory, which is ultimately like the id entity. So the id, Freudian wise, is the actual body self, survival self, the what I call the strategic self that's involved in exchanges with other people, so that everything is strategic actually, because we all need energy from other people, and therefore there's a sharing of energy between other people. And I mentioned this a little bit before about money. The concept with money is like, hey, I'll do this for you and you can do this for me. I'll swap my eggs for your bacon or whatever else. But because we like to eat more than just eggs and bacon, and there's wheat and there's bread and there's butter and there's all kinds of things involved, and then of course there's building houses and having cars and somebody to do the MOT and having to pay your taxes and all of these things, it's necessary to have money. But what the money is like a promise to pay. So if I want to build a house, I'm going to promise that I'm going to get things on credit, but I'm definitely going to pay it back. Which is where the whole idea of a mortgage come from. But the whole idea of money is the promise to pay. It's actually about trust. Isn't that fascinating? So, memory. That's all about memory. Bye for now.